Rachel Wearmouth, you're up first. What's your question?
So this question is from Alan, who says, I'm a big fan of the podcast.
Thank you, Alan.
And wanted to know what your reaction was to Keir Starmer's announcement about Labour keeping the Conservatives' two-child cap on benefits. Is this a knee-jerk reaction to what a subset in a focus group is saying, or is the Labour leadership now convinced of the moral need for draconian welfare policy?
Well, this is a really interesting question because it is one of the bigger political stories this week. And for any of our listeners who might have missed it, Keir Starmer said that he would not be reversing the two-child limit to child benefits, which was one of the sort of totemic George Osborne austerity policies announced in 2015, brought in 2017, which limits the amount that you can get to 2 children. And it's a big driver of child poverty. I think the latest official statistics, so these are official statistics, say 1 in 10 children live in households affected by the limit. So that's 1.5 million children overall. And there's all sorts of different stats flying around, but reversing it would apparently, according to some of the charities involved in this space, take 250,000 children out of poverty overnight, something that a lot of Labour politicians have been saying that they would reverse for a long time, including Keir Starmer. He said it in the past, and many significant figures, including the Shadow Work and Pensions Secretary, in the past have said how cruel the policy is. So it's quite a big emotional issue in the Labour Party, this one.
Within the Labour Party, it definitely is, yeah. I think it's worth saying there are some polls saying that the public does support keeping it, and Labour's determined to listen to polls as much as possible as opposed to what its own party members think. I think there's a number of sort of internal politics going on here, one of which is that Labour's got its National Policy Forum meeting coming up this Saturday, in which it'll kind of be the opening salvos between sort of factions of the Labour Party who want the next manifesto to take a certain shape or whatever. But I think some of the backlash here is kind of how Keir Starmer announced it, as in it was kind of just said very casually during an interview with Laura Kuenssberg. And because, as you say, it's such an emotional issue for many people who have been unable to claim benefits, as well as people in the party membership who are just vehemently opposed to it. And then there's a broader kind of political dynamic in which Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves are kind of like determined to be the most fiscally responsible people within the Labour Party, and they want to communicate that dynamic as strongly as they possibly can. And then there's kind of another thing which Keir Starmer hinted about when he was interviewed by Tony Blair at the Tony Blair Institute conference this week. And it was about just achieving stability and how that would achieve growth. But also in particular, he mentioned how the economy must be stable in order for businesses to partner with them on certain projects. One of those being the massive green industrial revolution that the party wants to achieve, that wants to make sure that the government looks like a reliable partner that businesses are willing to get into match fund projects with. So there's quite a few different things going on.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because the question that we've been asked is this to do with polling and sort of focus groups? And I would say sort of the bang average opinion is unfortunately what you mentioned, which is, you know, people feel that families ought to live within their means. And I'm doing inverted commas there for listeners who can't see me. And, you know, I have heard that come up, you know, when I've been interviewing people. I've covered the welfare system in this country for a really long time, and it is an opinion that's out there. But then they also ask, or is it sort of Labour being convinced of the moral need for draconian welfare policies? I don't think they're quite in that space yet. There's a third option that was being emphasised at the New Statesman summer drinks that we had earlier this week, where Rachel Reeves and Wes Streeting spoke, and they were saying, you know, it's the need for that fiscal discipline, wasn't it, for not making unfunded spending commitments. So I think this would cost about, I mean, one charity is saying 1.3 billion. I think some people think it would be a bit more than that, nearer 2 billion, and they just don't have you know, anything where they could raise the money to spend on reversing it. That's one of the arguments as well that wasn't mentioned by a questioner. But I think that's probably one of the most important, because this is the key thing that they're trying to drive.
Yeah, and taxes are a real high at the moment, and I think the Labour Party is very aware of that. But I think you're seeing them shift more to the right at the moment. During like Prime Minister's questions this week, for example, there's like a sort of subtle change in language from Keir Starmer, which went from sort of attacking Liz Truss's unfunded tax cuts to you know, unfunded spending. You know, there's going to be so little between the government and the Labour Party at the next election, I think.
This is really difficult, isn't it, for Labour frontbenchers as well? I mean, I was speaking to a Labour frontbench source who said that they'd even been warned to be quite careful how they criticise Tory cuts. And obviously, that's such a big part of Labour's message. You know, look at what you've done to the state and public services over the past 13 years. But even that language now, they have to moderate, which is interesting. And what you're saying, you're actually seeing it coming out in PMQs now. Rachel, what do you make of it? Rachel Cunliffe.
I think the fiscal responsibility, fiscal discipline point is the key one. I think Labour were really spooked by that front page of the Eye a couple of months ago, where the Eye had costed a whole load of Labour policies and suggested in their research that a lot of them were unfunded, and sort of Labour pushed back quite hard on that. But a key part of the message is all of the things that we want to do, we have thought about the finances. We're not getting out the big blank checkbook. We're not the party that you associate with kind of fecklessness and just splashing the cash left, right and centre. And so they are sort of now really trying to do the opposite, which is say, we're not going to suggest anything unless we've fully costed it. And the thing is, a lot of these policies you can't fully cost if you're in opposition. You want to wait until you're in government, and then you can have a proper look at the finances and you can look at it holistically and say, how much space do we have? What can we change? You don't have to sort of, as the opposition party, nail your colours to the mast in quite that detailed way. And that's why I think that this whole row is really more of a comms failure than anything else. Because yes, Laura Kuenssberg was setting a trap for Keir Starmer, as is going to happen a lot in the run-up to this election. You know, what about this policy? What do you think about it? But there's a way to answer that question that makes clear that Labour finds the current policy lacks compassion and is cruel and something that they'd want to do something about, but without committing. So what you say is, we think that this is a bad policy that has driven vulnerable families and children into poverty. We're not going to make any commitments until we can take a holistic view of the nation's finances, because we are committed to being fiscally responsible, but it's definitely something that we'd like to look at. You know, an answer that says we don't agree with it, but
good luck getting that one past Laura Kay. She would have cut you off after the first 2 seconds.
I'm not saying it's easy, but I'm saying that you can present the message that it's something that you'd like to look at without just going in an offhand way. Now we're not going to do anything about it, which makes it look really callous, I think. And I think that's what a lot of the backlash has been about. Not so much the policy itself, but the sort of offhand way he went, now we're not going to change it.
Yeah, I think it sort of wounds the soul of the Labour Party in a way. I mean, there's been issues like this before. I think Rachel Reeves in the past, you know, before the current role that she was in, said that she wanted to be tougher than the Tories on welfare. And John Ashworth, the Shadow Work and Pensions Secretary, he hasn't really said that much about universal credit, really. But one thing that he did come out and say was about how high fraud levels were. And so, you know, you see them kind of playing into this benefits scrounger, strivers versus skivers kind of mindset that we saw a lot of during the new Labour years, and also under Cameron and Osborne as well.
Yes, I would just sort of say in terms of like, the comms there, I think sort of the risk for Labour, I guess, in setting out a position like that, and I agree sort of there's a level of callousness, and they've been too casual about how they've communicated it. But the alternative to that is if the Labour Party says we're about to look at this, that may appear on the front page of the Eye as a spending commitment, you know, in another kind of world. But
he wanted to shut it down, didn't he?
He wanted to shut it down completely.
And he shut it down in one way and then opened up a whole new front.
Yeah, which made the new Statesman summer drinks quite a fractious event.
But I also
angry Labour people.
Yeah, I also don't think that the Labour Party is afraid of like some conflict clarifying their position, particularly with their own side. And I think it may be significant that they've chosen to do this the week before the National Policy Forum, because it's kind of a shot across the bows to those who want to call for the Labour Party to get out. And the Labour Party always does this. There's like a systemic failure to understand how the public sees benefits and welfare, particularly people who are working class, who you know, at the last election got the, you know, benefits nirvana, arguably as an option, and rejected it wholeheartedly, arguably because they don't want their lives to feel like they can't get some purchase in the system and that their existence is not relevant to the government.
Yeah.
The George Osborne justification for the policy was that you shouldn't receive more in benefits than, a hardworking family that is paying for those benefits. And obviously there are all kinds of reasons why that's not a appropriate or fair or constructive way to look at it. But I think that is why it's actually quite a popular policy.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I suppose even if you believed all of that framing, it's still not the child's fault. It's still not the third or fourth child's fault. But Will, as we've got you here, I mean, how much are the public finances really this much of a bind for Labour that they can't even make commitments to put a dent in child poverty?
Very much so. I think they, when you talk about the cost of it being, 1.3 billion or 2 billion, that doesn't sound like a whole lot. And you can say things like, oh, well, you just put VAT on private schools, that'll pay for that. Yeah. But the government currently has the highest borrowing costs this century. So the last 4 billion quid's worth of government debt that was sold at something like 5.7%. That means overseas investors are not paying as much for our government bonds, gilts, as they have in previous years. That puts up the government borrowing costs. And every time you make an unfunded spending commitment, unfunded spending commitments is also a great thing to remind voters of, because obviously, that reminds voters of Liz Truss. I think to a certain extent, Labour has to appear callous, because were they to say, right, we're going to take a view on this, markets might well assume that means they are going to remove the cap once in government, and that will affect how much they can borrow once in government. So, there's never been a time in recent history when governments have been more constrained by the markets, because gilt yields have been so high. They have come down a little bit thanks to inflation lowering in the last inflation print, but yeah, it's still very, very high relative to recent history. So they have to be incredibly careful. They have to keep saying, we're not going to spend this. And they can't just say, they can't say, well, we might not spend this out. They have to say we're not going to, right, in order to convince investors that there's not going to be loads and loads of cheap debt coming onto the market.
Can I ask a question then? Why doesn't that apply to the Conservatives going, oh, we might scrap inheritance tax?
Well, I think it does. I mean, that might be
or the Conservatives, they don't seem, the Conservatives, well, the government and the Telegraph does not seem sort of remotely worried that by saying we're going to scrap inheritance tax, which obviously will cost a lot more than removing the two-child benefit cap, they might sort of spook the markets and make borrowing more expensive for the government. They don't seem fussed by that.
Well, that might tell you about what they think their chances are of being the next government.
Thanks so much for watching. We'd love to know what you think. Please make sure you leave your comments below. And if you enjoyed watching this podcast, you can watch more of our videos on our YouTube channel. And don't forget to like and subscribe.